Mass deportations have officially kicked off, and it's creating shockwaves across the U.S. 10 states are right in the middle of Trump's immigration crackdown. Is your state one of them? Imagine farms with no workers, construction sites grinding to a halt, and entire communities living in fear. How are industries like agriculture and hospitality surviving these mass deportations? Are local governments pushing back, or is ICE tightening its grip? You're about to get all the juicy details and surprising facts because this is going to get intense. Let's jump right in and see what's going down across the country. Plus, let me know in the comments, should states push back or comply with these federal orders? Number 1, California. The state that's been at the center of the immigration debate for years. California is a massive place, like seriously huge. It has the largest undocumented immigrant population in the U.S., estimated at around 2 million people. That's about 1 out of every 10 people in the state. With such a large community, it's no surprise that California is feeling the full brunt of Trump's immigration policies. You've probably heard of California being a sanctuary state, basically a place that protects undocumented immigrants from federal deportation efforts. But under Trump, things are changing fast. While some cities, like Los Angeles, try to push back against federal orders, the pressure is growing. ICE raids are happening more frequently, and it's becoming harder for undocumented folks to feel safe, even in safe zones. In fact, California has seen a 30% increase in deportations since Trump took office. And remember, it's not just about immigrants with criminal records, families, workers, and even students are caught in the crossfire. Now, here's where it gets even crazier. California's agricultural industry is heavily dependent on immigrant labor. In fact, about 48% of farm workers are undocumented, and they help produce over $50 billion in crops every year. So, if you love avocados, strawberries, or wine, who doesn't, right? You're seeing the real impact of these policies firsthand. As enforcement ramps up, some of the state's most important sectors are struggling. It's a mess, and the pressure is only increasing as local authorities try to balance federal orders with protecting their communities. But let me tell you, California is not backing down easily. There are massive protests, marches, and even court cases happening right now. Did you know that California spends over $3 billion annually on immigrant-related services? Yeah, that's a huge chunk of change, but it shows just how much the state relies on its immigrant population. So, if you're wondering what's next, expect things to get even more heated. It's not over yet. Number 2, Texas. Texas, and honestly, this state is right at the front lines of everything when it comes to immigration. Texas shares a 1,254-mile border with Mexico, so it's no wonder that about 11% of the state's population is undocumented. That's around 2 million people. The state has seen a huge increase in ICE activity, and it's not just on the border. Texas has seen an uptick in raids all over, including in urban areas like Dallas, Houston, and San Antonio. The fear is real, especially with more families being separated. So, what's driving this? Well, Trump's big plan to build that border wall isn't just about a physical structure. It's about creating an atmosphere of fear too. The idea is that by making the border more secure and pushing more law enforcement into the state, it'll be harder for undocumented immigrants to stay, and boy has it worked. In 2018 alone, Texas saw more than 100,000 deportations, and that number only went up in 2019. These enforcement actions are targeting those with criminal records, but they've also been extending to regular workers who are just trying to make a living. Did you know that Texas has the highest number of migrant workers in the U.S.? That means agriculture, construction, and hospitality industries rely on these workers to function. You might not even realize how much Texas's economy depends on immigrant labor. Without them, things would be very different. If you think it's just a border issue, think again. Texas's large immigrant population has its roots in Mexico, but the state also sees an influx of folks from Central America and Asia. As enforcement increases, it's not just affecting the border communities, it's shaking up the entire state's economy. If you're in Texas, buckle up because things are changing fast. Number 3, Florida. A state that's always in the spotlight, especially when it comes to immigration. Florida's immigrant population is growing fast, with about 21% of Floridians born outside the U.S. And guess what? More than 40% of Florida's population is made up of Hispanic, Latino immigrants, mainly from places like Cuba, Puerto Rico, and Mexico. Florida's economy relies heavily on these immigrant communities, whether it's in agriculture, hospitality, or construction. But now, Trump's crackdown on illegal immigration is putting all of that at risk. You see, Florida is not just a place where tourists go to sip margaritas. It's a major agriculture hub, especially for crops like citrus, sugarcane, and tomatoes. In fact, more than 90% of the workers in Florida's agricultural industry are undocumented immigrants. Yep, that's right, 90%. So, when deportation policies hit the state, it has huge economic consequences. In 2018, there was a 10% drop in agricultural production in some regions due to the labor shortage caused by ICE raids. Imagine trying to pick fruit or harvest crops without enough workers. It's chaos. And let's not forget about the construction industry. Florida is booming with new buildings, homes, and resorts, and again, undocumented immigrants are a huge part of this workforce. If they're forced to leave, you'll see construction projects get delayed or even shut down. ICE raids in cities like Miami, Orlando, and Tampa have made workers nervous, and they're starting to hide out, which only slows down the economy. It's a double-edged sword. Deportations hurt immigrant families, but they're also hurting the state's businesses and industries. Florida's economy is so reliant on immigrant labor that it contributes over $85 billion to the state's GDP every year. That's $85 billion with a B. So, yeah, these deportation policies aren't just about politics. They affect real people and businesses trying to make ends meet. Number 4, Arizona. Arizona is one of those states that's always been in the thick of the immigration conversation. With a massive border with Mexico and a population that's more than 12% undocumented, Arizona's immigration issues are nothing new. But with Trump's crackdown, things are getting even more intense. Arizona has a long history of tough immigration laws, with the infamous SB 1070 law in 2010, which allowed police officers to ask for immigration papers if they suspected someone was in the country illegally. Yeah, that caused quite the uproar. Now, with Trump's policies pushing for more deportations and raids, Arizona is facing even more pressure. And the numbers don't lie. Over 77,000 immigrants were deported from Arizona between 2017 and 2019, with most of those being undocumented workers from countries like Mexico and Guatemala. Imagine the impact this has on families, especially when many of them have lived in Arizona for decades. Here's the thing. Arizona has a major agriculture industry. It's known for producing cotton, lettuce, and grapes, and guess what? The people picking those crops are often undocumented workers. If they get deported, guess what happens to the crops? Yeah, they sit in the fields and rot. It's an economic nightmare. ICE raids are making this situation worse, and with enforcement so close to home, workers are fleeing to other states or hiding, which makes the whole economy more unstable. It's a perfect storm, and things are only getting more complicated as local and federal tensions rise. Arizona's farming industry depends on over 100,000 migrant workers every year. These workers keep the state's agricultural engine running smoothly. Without them, the state's economy would grind to a halt. So, yeah, these deportation efforts aren't just affecting immigrants, they're affecting the entire state. Number 5, New York. New York, the state that's always been a symbol of opportunity, diversity, and progress for immigrants. New York City has long been known as a sanctuary city, a place where immigrants, including the undocumented, can live and work without the constant fear of being detained by ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement. However, under Trump's administration, the sanctuary status and the protections it offered have been under intense pressure as his crackdown on illegal immigration grows stronger. Now, New York has over 3 million immigrants, which make up about 40% of the city's population. It's the cultural heart of the U.S., with people from every corner of the globe calling it home. These immigrants contribute massively to the state's economy, workforce, and culture. From Wall Street to Harlem, Chinatown to Astoria, the state's immigrant population is deeply woven into its social fabric. But while New York prides itself on being a welcoming home for immigrants, it's facing some serious challenges as deportations ramp up. One of the key issues here is the way Trump's policies are targeting sanctuary cities. Sanctuary cities are places where local law enforcement doesn't cooperate with federal immigration agents to detain and deport individuals solely based on their immigration status. New York City has proudly called itself a sanctuary city for decades, but now ICE has been increasingly active in the city. In fact, in 2018, New York saw more than 1,000 arrests related to ICE, and that number has only grown since. What's even more alarming is that ICE isn't just targeting undocumented immigrants with criminal records, they're also focusing on individuals who've been living in the city for years, building families, businesses, and communities. In New York's construction industry, hospitality, and healthcare, immigrants are essential. Did you know that 25% of the city's construction workers are undocumented, and in the hospitality sector, over 30% of workers are immigrants too? So, imagine what happens when thousands of workers are threatened with deportation. Construction projects get delayed, restaurants struggle, and the city's iconic skyline could be in danger. Immigrant labor helps keep everything ticking in New York, from the high-rise buildings to the restaurants and even the subways. New York City alone spends around $200 million a year to provide legal defense for immigrants facing deportation. Why? Because even though the city is doing its best to protect its immigrant population, the federal government's policies are creating real fear among families. And with more than 500,000 undocumented immigrants in the 5 boroughs, that's a lot of people who could be impacted by this. Number 6, Nevada. Now, let's head to the Sunshine State of the West, Nevada, known for its glitzy Las Vegas Strip, vibrant entertainment scene, and vast desert landscapes. Nevada is also home to a growing immigrant community, many of whom are undocumented. The state's immigrant population makes up a significant portion of its workforce, with nearly 18% of Nevadans being foreign-born. In fact, there are more than 400,000 undocumented immigrants living in Nevada, and many of them work in critical industries such as hospitality, construction, and agriculture. But things are getting tough under Trump's immigration crackdown. Nevada has seen an increase in ICE activity. Raids are happening more frequently, and these are having a direct impact on the state's economy. Since Nevada's tourism industry is one of the biggest contributors to its GDP, worth over $60 billion annually, it's no surprise that undocumented workers play a big role in keeping it running. Think about it. Who's working in the hotels, casinos, restaurants, and cleaning services? Yep, it's those immigrants, many of whom are undocumented. With the rise in deportations, some workers are now afraid to show up for their shifts, and others have even left the state in search of safer options. According to recent estimates, Nevada has seen a 20% drop in the number of immigrant workers in sectors like hospitality and construction due to fear of deportation. This has led to some serious labor shortages, and businesses are struggling to keep up with demand. But here's the kicker. Nevada's agriculture industry also relies heavily on immigrant labor. You might not immediately think of Nevada as an agricultural powerhouse, but the state grows a surprising amount of crops like alfalfa, hay, and melons, particularly in the rural farming communities. The agricultural census revealed that nearly 30% of Nevada farm workers are undocumented. Without them, the state's farming sector would take a massive hit. In fact, several large farms have already started feeling the pressure of labor shortages caused by deportation fears. Nevada's Las Vegas Strip employs over 200,000 people in tourism-related jobs, and nearly 40% of those workers are immigrants. Imagine how a potential labor shortage could impact all those neon lights, fancy hotels, and world-class shows. If Trump's crackdown continues, the ripple effect will be felt from the slot machines to the buffets. Number 7, Washington. You might think of Seattle, home to tech giants like Amazon and Microsoft, but Washington is so much more than just a tech hub. It's a state that also heavily relies on immigrant labor, especially in sectors like agriculture, construction, and healthcare. Immigrants make up about 14% of Washington's population, and within that, a significant number are undocumented. In fact, there are about 400,000 undocumented immigrants in Washington alone, contributing to everything from picking apples in the orchards to fixing up the latest tech gadgets. Washington is a major player in the U.S. agricultural industry, particularly when it comes to producing apples, cherries, and wheat. The state is the nation's largest producer of apples, generating $2.5 billion in revenue every year. But guess who's doing most of that work? Yep, it's immigrant workers, many of whom are undocumented. In fact, an estimated one-third of the workers in Washington's agriculture sector are undocumented immigrants. Now, here's the thing. Trump's immigration policies have started to change the landscape here. As deportations rise, many workers are becoming scared and avoiding jobs in the fields, leaving the farms in a lurch. This fear of ICE raids has also impacted the state's booming construction sector, where a large percentage of workers are immigrants. And with fewer workers showing up to these jobs, projects get delayed or even canceled, which harms local businesses. But it's not just agriculture and construction. Seattle's tech industry also feels the heat from these policies. Many of the people working in the city's tech sector are highly skilled immigrants, often on work visas or as undocumented tech talent. With Trump's crackdown, these talented workers are becoming more cautious, and some are even leaving Washington in search of better opportunities in more immigrant-friendly states. This is a huge loss for a state that prides itself on its innovative tech culture. Did you know that Washington's apple industry relies on over 50,000 seasonal farm workers, and about half of them are undocumented immigrants? That's a lot of apples and a lot of people in need of protection. Number 8, Oregon. Oregon, one of the most beautiful and also one of the most progressive states in the U.S., known for its lush landscapes, amazing coffee, and thriving craft beer scene. Oregon is also home to a significant immigrant community. Roughly 1 in 8 Oregonians are immigrants, and almost 10% of Oregon's workforce is made up of undocumented individuals. In recent years, though, Oregon has faced more challenges with the rise of Trump's immigration enforcement. Oregon's agriculture industry is particularly important, and here's where the numbers get interesting. Farm workers in Oregon are essential to the state's economy, particularly in the hazelnut, berry, and grass seed industries. The state is also home to one of the largest wine industries in the country, and guess who's doing the labor? Immigrants. In fact, about 40% of farm workers in Oregon are undocumented, and the state's farm labor force is highly reliant on their contributions. But here's the problem. Oregon's local governments have historically fought against ICE raids and tried to create safe spaces for immigrants. Still, the fear surrounding deportations has been a significant problem. With deportation rates rising across the state, many immigrant families are experiencing anxiety, and workers are even leaving certain industries to avoid being detained. That means fewer hands are available to pick the berries or tend to the vineyards, which could ultimately affect Oregon's billion-dollar agricultural sector. What's even more concerning is that many of these workers don't have access to driver's licenses or health care, making them vulnerable not just to deportation but to workplace exploitation. ICE raids in rural Oregon towns have created widespread fear, and advocates are worried about the long-term effects on the state's economy. After all, without a stable immigrant workforce, industries like agriculture, food production, and even construction could face labor shortages, which would lead to higher prices and slower economic growth. Oregon's wine industry is worth $5.6 billion annually, and it's driven by a massive immigrant workforce. Without these workers, many of Oregon's famous vineyards would be in serious trouble. Number 9, North Carolina. North Carolina, a state that's been rapidly growing in population over the past few decades, especially among immigrants. North Carolina is home to about 1 million undocumented immigrants, and many of them work in industries that keep the state's economy running, like agriculture, construction, and textiles. While some areas of the state are more conservative, many cities have embraced their growing immigrant communities. But Trump's crackdown on illegal immigration is making life more difficult for these families. One of the biggest challenges North Carolina faces is its dependence on immigrant labor in agriculture. With crops like tobacco, sweet potatoes, and cotton, North Carolina's farming sector is worth over $13 billion annually. But guess what? Almost half of the workers who harvest these crops are undocumented immigrants. Without their hard work, the state's agriculture industry would struggle to meet its demands. ICE raids have already begun to target migrant workers, and many have started leaving the state for fear of being detained or deported. It's not just agriculture that's feeling the strain. Construction in North Carolina is booming, with Charlotte, Raleigh, and Durham seeing major projects spring up all over. But guess who's doing much of the labor? Immigrants, of course. Without them, many construction projects would grind to a halt, which would have a serious economic impact. According to one study, if undocumented workers were removed from North Carolina's workforce, it would lead to a $2 billion loss in economic output. Did you know that North Carolina is one of the largest producers of sweet potatoes in the U.S.? Yep, and many of those sweet potatoes are harvested by immigrant workers who are being affected by Trump's deportation push. Number 10, Georgia. Georgia, a state that's become a major player in the agricultural world, and guess who's helping to power that industry? You guessed it, immigrants. In Georgia, nearly 10% of the population is undocumented, and they play a massive role in everything from picking peaches to building highways. Georgia's agriculture industry, particularly its famous peach orchards and poultry farms, relies heavily on immigrant labor. In fact, it's estimated that 1/3 of Georgia's farm workers are undocumented. The state produces over $70 billion in agricultural goods every year, and much of that is thanks to the hard work of undocumented immigrants. But the Trump administration's crackdown is throwing a wrench into everything. ICE raids have hit local farms hard, and many workers are too scared to show up for work, which means crops are left unharvested. But it's not just farming. Georgia's construction industry also relies heavily on immigrant labor. With cities like Atlanta growing rapidly, construction workers are in high demand. Without undocumented workers, these projects would slow down significantly, hurting the state's economy and job market. In fact, a 2019 report estimated that deportations could cost Georgia more than $1.6 billion annually in lost productivity. Georgia is the nation's top producer of peaches, and over 60% of the workers in Georgia's peach orchards are undocumented immigrants. So, next time you bite into a juicy Georgia peach, just remember the immigrant workers who made it possible.